March 23, 1968. Firebase Charlie, South Vietnam. Army medic Thomas Sullivan treated 347 wounded soldiers during his tour. He saved lives that doctors said couldn't be saved. He performed surgery under enemy fire. He was recommended for the Medal of Honor twice. The Army called him a hero. His patients called him a miracle worker. His family called him the bravest man they knew. But when Thomas Sullivan returned from Vietnam in 1969, he never spoke about the war. He never claimed his decorations. He locked his medical bag in the basement and never practiced medicine again. For 55 years, that bag sat untouched. Until his granddaughter found it at an estate sale, opened it, and discovered what her grandfather had really been doing in the jungle. What she found inside wasn't just medical supplies. It was evidence of war crimes so systematic and documented that it could have changed history. And her grandfather hadn't been covering them up, he'd been recording them. Subscribe because some heroes document the truth, even when it destroys them. Thomas Sullivan was 22 years old when he volunteered for medic training in 1967. The Vietnam War was escalating, and the Army needed medical personnel who could work under impossible conditions. Thomas had grown up on a farm in Ohio, the son of a veterinarian who taught him that healing was sacred work. He scored highest in his medic training class. His instructors noted his exceptional composure under pressure and natural surgical instincts. He was assigned to the 1st Cavalry Division and shipped to Vietnam in February 1968, just weeks after the Tet Offensive had shocked the world. Firebase Charlie was a forward operating base 30 miles northwest of Saigon, carved out of dense jungle and surrounded by enemy territory. It housed 200 soldiers and served as a staging area for search and destroy missions into Viet Cong strongholds. The base had a small aid station, barely more than a tent with cots and basic supplies. Thomas Sullivan became its head medic within 2 months of arrival, not because of rank but because no one else could keep soldiers alive under such conditions. His reputation spread quickly. Other medics called him Magic Hands Sullivan. Soldiers would request transfer to his unit specifically because they knew if they got hit, Sullivan would get them home. What they didn't know was that Thomas was documenting everything he saw. Not just medical procedures but war crimes. It started with the first prisoner he was ordered to treat. March 15, 1968. A Viet Cong fighter, maybe 17 years old, brought in with a leg wound. Standard protocol: treat the enemy wounded only after American casualties were stabilized. But this kid had been shot 6 more times after capture. In the back. While restrained. The commanding officer, Captain Bradley Reeves, told Thomas to take his time with the treatment. Let the prisoner suffer. Make him talk. Thomas treated the wounds immediately. The boy survived. But Thomas wrote down everything in a small notebook he kept in his medical bag. Enemy prisoner executed while in custody. Multiple gunshot wounds post-capture. No military intelligence gained. Violation of Geneva Convention Article 3. That was the first entry. There would be 400 more. Over his 13-month tour, Thomas Sullivan documented systematic war crimes committed by American forces. Execution of prisoners. Torture of civilians. Chemical weapons used against non-combatants. Orders to kill wounded enemy soldiers instead of treating them. But he didn't just write about what he witnessed. He collected evidence. Photographs of torture victims. Recordings of officers giving illegal orders. Blood samples that proved chemical weapon exposure. Medical reports that contradicted official casualty figures. He stored everything in his medical bag, hidden beneath false compartments he'd constructed himself. During the day he saved American lives. At night he documented American war crimes. Thomas never intended to become a whistleblower. He was documenting evidence for post-war investigations that he assumed would happen naturally. Surely the Army would want to know about rogue units committing atrocities. Surely someone in command would put a stop to it. But the longer his tour lasted, the more he realized the crimes weren't aberrations. They were policy. The turning point came on November 12, 1968. A village sweep operation 15 miles from Firebase Charlie. Intelligence had reported Viet Cong weapons caches hidden in civilian homes. Thomas was attached to provide medical support. What he witnessed that day was a massacre. The unit found no weapons. No enemy fighters. Just families, old men, women, children. But Captain Reeves ordered the village burned anyway. When civilians tried to flee, soldiers opened fire. Thomas treated a 6-year-old girl with shrapnel wounds. A grandmother with severe burns. A teenage boy shot while carrying his baby sister to safety. He also treated the Americans who'd been accidentally wounded in the crossfire. Soldiers who'd been shot by their own officers when they refused to participate in the killing. That night, Thomas made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He began preparing evidence not just for post-war investigations, but for immediate action. He photographed mass graves. He recorded dying declarations from Vietnamese civilians. He documented the systematic destruction of evidence by his own officers. And he started planning how to get the evidence home. Thomas Sullivan's tour ended on March 22, 1969. He was awarded the Bronze Star, the Purple Heart, and a commendation for life-saving medical service. At the ceremony, Captain Reeves personally thanked him for his loyalty and discretion. "Some medics might have gotten the wrong idea about what they saw over here," Reeves said quietly. "But you understand that war is messy. You understand that good soldiers sometimes have to make hard choices." Thomas nodded and shook the captain's hand. But that night, he made copies of his evidence and mailed them to 3 different locations: his family home in Ohio, a safe deposit box in San Francisco, and the office of Senator William Fulbright, chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Then he flew home, carrying the original documents in his medical bag. Thomas Sullivan returned to a country that was already turning against the Vietnam War. The My Lai massacre had been exposed. Anti-war protests filled the streets. Congress was demanding investigations into military conduct. Thomas thought his evidence would be welcomed. Instead, it nearly destroyed him. The FBI visited him 3 days after his return. They said they were conducting a routine interview with returning veterans. They asked about his service, his experiences, his observations of enemy tactics. They never asked about war crimes. But they made it clear they knew about his documentation. "Sometimes soldiers see things that might be misinterpreted by civilians," one agent said. "Things that could damage morale on the home front. Things that might aid enemy propaganda efforts." They suggested Thomas focus on healing from his war experiences rather than dwelling on traumatic memories that might not be accurate. When Thomas mentioned the evidence he'd collected, the agents became very interested. They wanted to see his medical bag. For security reasons, they said. To make sure he hadn't accidentally brought home classified materials. Thomas refused. That night, someone broke into his parents' house. Nothing was stolen, but his childhood bedroom was searched thoroughly. His father's veterinary office was also burglarized. The safe deposit box in San Francisco was accessed by someone with federal credentials. But they never found the medical bag. Thomas had hidden it in the one place they'd never think to look, buried beneath the floor of his family's root cellar. For 3 months, Thomas tried to get officials to examine his evidence. He called Senator Fulbright's office repeatedly. He wrote to the Washington Post, the New York Times, the Army Inspector General. He contacted lawyers, civil rights organizations, veterans groups. The response was always the same: "We appreciate your service, but we're not able to pursue this matter at this time." Meanwhile, the harassment escalated. Thomas was followed everywhere he went. His phone was clearly being monitored. His mail was opened and resealed. Friends and family members were questioned about his mental health and political associations. In June 1969, Thomas received a visit from his former commanding officer, now Major Bradley Reeves. Reeves had been reassigned to the Pentagon and was in Ohio on official business. "Tom," Reeves said, sitting in the Sullivan family kitchen, "you're a good soldier. You saved a lot of American lives over there. But you're having trouble adjusting to civilian life. That's normal. What's not normal is obsessing over things that happened in a war zone." Reeves offered Thomas a deal. Full disability benefits. A clean military record. Medical care for what would be classified as post-traumatic stress disorder. All he had to do was turn over his evidence and agree never to discuss his Vietnam experiences publicly. "Think about your family," Reeves said. "Think about your future. Some secrets are too dangerous to keep." Thomas asked for time to consider the offer. That night he made his choice. He destroyed everything. The photographs, the recordings, the documents, he burned them all in his father's fireplace. Everything except the original notebooks, which he sealed in waterproof containers and buried deeper in the root cellar. Then he accepted Reeves's deal. He was quietly diagnosed with PTSD and given a medical discharge with full benefits. He moved to a small town in northern Ohio, far from his family, and never spoke about Vietnam again. For 55 years, Thomas Sullivan lived with his secret. He worked as a maintenance supervisor at a small college. He married a librarian named Ruth and raised 2 children. He volunteered at the local hospital but never mentioned his medical training. His family knew he was a veteran, but he deflected all questions about his service. His children grew up believing their father had been a supply clerk or mechanic. Even his wife didn't know he'd been a medic until after he died. Thomas Sullivan died on September 14, 2022, at age 77. Heart failure, brought on by decades of carrying a burden too heavy for one man to bear. His death made the local obituary page. Thomas Sullivan, 77, beloved husband and father, Vietnam veteran. No mention of heroism. No mention of lives saved. No mention of the secret he'd carried for more than half a century. His granddaughter, Jennifer Sullivan, was 28 years old and working as an investigative journalist for the Cleveland Plain Dealer. She'd been close to her grandfather, but like everyone else, she'd never known about his war service. After the funeral, the family began clearing out Thomas's house. Jennifer was assigned to the basement. Old furniture, holiday decorations, decades of accumulated memories. She found the medical bag buried beneath a pile of paint cans in the furthest corner of the root cellar. It was waterproof, military grade, and still locked. Inside the bag, she found medical instruments that were clearly vintage. Bandages from the 1960s. Medications with expiration dates from 1969. And at the bottom, wrapped in oiled cloth, 3 waterproof containers. The notebooks were in perfect condition. Written in her grandfather's precise handwriting, they documented 13 months of war crimes in methodical detail. Names, dates, locations, photographs. Medical evidence of torture. Recorded confessions from dying civilians. Jennifer sat in that basement for 3 hours, reading by flashlight, slowly realizing that her quiet grandfather had been documenting one of the most comprehensive collections of Vietnam War crime evidence ever assembled. The first notebook covered March-July 1968. Individual incidents, each carefully documented. March 18. Civilian casualty presented with burns consistent with white phosphorus exposure. No enemy contact reported for this grid square. Chemical weapons used against non-combatants. April 3. Prisoner died under interrogation. Cause of death: internal hemorrhaging from repeated blunt force trauma. No intelligence obtained. Body disposed of without documentation. May 12. Village elder executed for suspected VC sympathies. No evidence presented. Family members forced to watch. 3 children now orphaned. The second notebook covered August-December 1968. The documentation became more systematic. August 22. Captain Reeves instituted new prisoner protocol. Quote, "Dead men tell no tales and they don't use up resources. Medical treatment of enemy wounded now discouraged." September 15. Supply sergeant reports ammunition expenditure inconsistent with enemy contact reports. Investigation reveals soldiers firing on livestock and civilian structures for entertainment. October 7. Psychological evaluation of unit shows 60% exhibiting symptoms of moral injury. Recommended rotation denied. Quote from Major Harrison, "They'll adjust or break. Either way, the mission continues." The third notebook was different. Thomas had begun connecting individual incidents to larger patterns. November 20. Systematic destruction of civilian infrastructure not militarily justified. Wells poisoned. Crops burned. Population displacement appears to be policy objective. December 5. Medical supplies being diverted from civilian aid programs to black market operations. Penicillin sold to highest bidder while children die of treatable infections. January 10. Evidence of coordination between multiple units. War crimes not isolated incidents but organized campaign of terror against civilian population. But it was the final entry that made Jennifer understand why her grandfather had stayed silent. February 15, 1969. Learned that documentation efforts discovered. Captain Reeves knows about evidence collection. Other unit medics receiving transfers or accidents. Medical personnel who report war crimes being eliminated. Going underground until safe extraction possible. Jennifer called in sick to work the next day. She digitized every page, every photograph, every document. Then she began the most important investigation of her career. The first thing she discovered was that many of the names in her grandfather's notebooks were now prominent figures in business and government. Captain Bradley Reeves had retired as a full colonel and was now CEO of a major defense contractor. Major Harrison had become a federal judge. Several soldiers mentioned in the war crimes documentation had become police chiefs, city officials, and corporate executives. Jennifer reached out to Vietnam veterans organizations, military historians, and war crimes researchers. The response was immediate and overwhelming. What her grandfather had documented correlated with dozens of other accounts that had never been officially investigated. Dr. Margaret Chin, a historian at the University of California who specialized in Vietnam War atrocities, called it the most comprehensive documentation of systematic war crimes by American forces ever discovered. Your grandfather wasn't just a witness, Dr. Chin told Jennifer. He was collecting evidence for the war crimes tribunal that never happened. This documentation could reopen dozens of cases that were buried by the military. But when Jennifer tried to publish her findings, she encountered the same resistance her grandfather had faced 55 years earlier. The Cleveland Plain Dealer declined to run the story, citing concerns about unverifiable historical claims. The Washington Post said they were not currently investigating Vietnam-era stories. The New York Times said the evidence was too old to be newsworthy. Major newspapers wouldn't touch it. Television networks weren't interested. Even military journals declined to review the documentation. But Jennifer had one advantage her grandfather hadn't: the internet. She created a website, The Medic's Evidence. She uploaded digital copies of every document, every photograph, every page of her grandfather's notebooks. She provided historical context, corroborating evidence, and contact information for researchers who wanted to investigate further. The site went viral within 48 hours. Veterans' families came forward with their own stories. Researchers began connecting Jennifer's evidence to other documented atrocities. International human rights organizations demanded that the U.S. government respond to the revelations. Within a week, Jennifer received a phone call from the same law firm that had represented government whistleblowers like Daniel Ellsberg and Karen Silkwood. Sullivan, the lawyer said, your grandfather's evidence is the most significant documentation of Vietnam War crimes ever made public. But you need to understand, there are people who will do anything to discredit or destroy this information. The lawyer was right. Within 2 weeks of the website going live, Jennifer began experiencing the same harassment her grandfather had endured. Her car was vandalized. Her apartment was burglarized. Her editor at the Plain Dealer suggested she take a leave of absence to deal with family matters. But the evidence was already public. Other journalists began investigating the names in Thomas Sullivan's notebooks. Congressional representatives called for hearings. International courts announced they were reviewing the documentation for potential war crimes prosecutions. In November 2024, the House Veterans Affairs Committee held hearings on historical atrocities and military accountability. Jennifer Sullivan was called as the lead witness. Mr. Chairman, she said, reading from prepared testimony, my grandfather Thomas Sullivan was a hero. Not because he saved lives in Vietnam, though he did that too. He was a hero because he documented the truth when it was dangerous to do so. He collected evidence of war crimes knowing it could destroy his life. And when he was forced to choose between his safety and his conscience, he chose to protect the evidence. She held up one of the original notebooks. This documentation represents the moral courage of one soldier who refused to let atrocities be forgotten. It represents 13 months of methodical evidence collection under the most dangerous conditions imaginable. And it represents a 55-year cover-up of war crimes that the American people deserve to know about. The committee chairman, Representative James Crawford, a Vietnam veteran himself, responded quietly, Ms. Sullivan, your grandfather's evidence is both devastating and necessary. These hearings will ensure that the truth he preserved finally sees the light of day. But even as congressional hearings began, attempts to discredit the evidence continued. A retired general claimed the notebooks were forgeries. A Pentagon spokesperson suggested Thomas Sullivan had been suffering from undiagnosed mental illness. Conservative media outlets accused Jennifer of anti-American propaganda. Dr. Margaret Chen's forensic analysis proved the documents were authentic. Handwriting experts confirmed Thomas Sullivan's authorship. Chemical analysis of the paper and ink proved the notebooks dated to the 1960s. More importantly, other evidence began emerging. Veterans who'd served with Thomas came forward to confirm his accounts. Military historians found corroborating documentation in archived records. International journalists located Vietnamese survivors who remembered Thomas as the American medic who treated their wounds and documented their suffering. In December 2024, the Department of Defense issued an official statement acknowledging that some units operating in Vietnam may have engaged in activities that violated military protocol and international law. The statement promised thorough review of historical records and appropriate accountability measures. It wasn't the full acknowledgement that Jennifer had hoped for, but it was a start. Thomas Sullivan was posthumously awarded the Congressional Gold Medal for extraordinary courage in documenting war crimes and preserving evidence of historical atrocities. The citation noted that his moral courage and commitment to truth exemplify the highest values of military service. Jennifer accepted the award on her grandfather's behalf. In her speech, she said, "My grandfather carried the burden of this evidence for 55 years. He could have destroyed it. He could have forgotten what he witnessed. Instead, he preserved the truth for future generations. He believed that democracy requires accountability, and that accountability requires evidence." She paused, looking at the medal. "This honor isn't just for my grandfather. It's for every soldier who refuses to look the other way when they witness war crimes. It's for every veteran who chooses truth over silence. And it's for every American who believes that our military should represent our highest values, not our darkest impulses." The medical bag that started Jennifer's investigation is now housed at the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History. Visitors can see Thomas Sullivan's instruments, his notebooks, and the evidence he preserved for more than half a century. A placard next to the display reads, "The tools of healing can also be the tools of justice." Sometimes the greatest act of patriotism is documenting the truth, even when that truth is painful. Thomas Sullivan never lived to see his evidence made public. He never received recognition for his courage. He died carrying secrets that had cost him 55 years of silence. But his granddaughter made sure his silence wasn't permanent. "Heroes don't always get parades," Jennifer wrote in her book about her grandfather's story. "Sometimes heroism means carrying the truth until someone else is strong enough to speak it." The evidence Thomas Sullivan collected has been used to reopen 17 war crimes investigations. 3 former officers have been stripped of their honors. International courts have cited his documentation in ongoing human rights cases. More importantly, his evidence has become part of military ethics training. New soldiers learn about Thomas Sullivan as an example of moral courage under impossible circumstances. Every medic graduating from Army medical training receives a card with Thomas Sullivan's words. "The duty to heal includes the duty to protect the innocent. Sometimes the most important medicine we can provide is truth." His story reminds us that some secrets are too important to keep buried. And that true heroes don't just save lives, they save conscience.